Jonathan Edwards' life and ministry had an impact for God that few men have equaled. He lived from 1703 to 1758, and he spent the majority of his life in the colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts. He was a brilliant thinker who deeply loved the Lord and sought with all of his might to live his life for Him. Though he was a very intense person who held unswervingly to his convictions, he did not have a bombastic or outgoing personality. People described him as shy and introspective. But Jonathan Edwards made an eternal impact through the sermons he preached, the words he wrote, the relationships he built, and the spiritual awakening that God brought through him. Jonathan Edwards was born in 1703 in South Windsor, Connecticut, the son of Congregational pastor Timothy Edwards. In 1716, at 12 years of age, he was admitted to Yale College in New Haven, Connecticut. Jonathan graduated from Yale 4 years later, and then he stayed there to study for the ministry for 2 years. He spent the next 8 months as a student pastor at the First Presbyterian Church in New York City. It was while he was working in New York, at 18 years of age, that he began writing his famous 70 resolutions, which would guide him throughout his life. Here's a small sample. Resolved never to do any manner of thing, whether in soul or body, less or more, but what tends to the glory of God. Resolved never to lose one moment of time, but improve it the most profitable way I possibly can. Resolved never to do anything which I should be afraid to do if it were the last hour of my life. In 1726, 22-year-old Jonathan Edwards was called to be the assistant pastor to his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, in his church in Northampton, Massachusetts. The next year, Jonathan married a godly young lady, Sarah Pierpont. Then in 1729, Jonathan's pastor and grandfather died, and 25-year-old Jonathan Edwards became the pastor of the Northampton church. In 1734, after Jonathan had been pastor for 5 years, a powerful revival broke out among the young people in the church in Northampton. It spread to people of all ages in the church, and then it overflowed to the entire town of Northampton. In the years that followed, as spiritual awakening spread to churches in town after town throughout Massachusetts and Connecticut, several pastors began to see to it that every local congregation of those colonies had experienced revival. When they found a church that seemed to resist revival, they would send key pastors to preach there. One such congregation was in the town of Enfield, Connecticut. On July 8, 1741, Jonathan Edwards was invited to preach at the church in Enfield. The 37-year-old preacher read his sermon to the people assembled. Before he was finished, Holy Spirit conviction of sin came over the crowd so powerfully that people were crying out to God for mercy. The wailing grew so loud that Jonathan Edwards was forced to cut the sermon short, as he and the other preachers dealt with people for hours. That sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, is one of the most famous sermons ever preached. The revival that had begun in Jonathan Edwards' church in Northampton and spread throughout all the colonies became known as the Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards became friends with a young missionary to the Indians named David Brainerd. Jonathan's daughter Jerusha fell in love with David Brainerd and was engaged to marry him until David Brainerd died of tuberculosis at 29 years of age in the Edwards home. After Brainerd's death, Jonathan Edwards published his diary, which became a major impetus in the explosion of world missions in the centuries that followed. In the late 1740s, a dispute began to arise in the Northampton church over the Lord's Supper. Pastor Edwards insisted that only professing believers should participate, but tradition allowed everyone to take communion. By 1750, most of the congregation had turned against Edwards, and he was overwhelmingly voted out of his pulpit. He then became pastor of a church in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he pastored for 7 years, reaching both the settlers and the Indians for Christ. Throughout his life, Jonathan wrote extensively and brilliantly. His abundant writings include The Great Doctrine of Original Sin Defended, a treatise concerning religious affections, and Thoughts on the Revival of Religion in New England. There are many historical markers and monuments erected in Jonathan Edwards' honor. On Main Street in South Windsor, Connecticut, there's a marker noting his birthplace, and another acknowledging the church that his father pastored. Inside the church building where he pastored in Northampton, there's a bronze monument commemorating his ministry. In Enfield, Connecticut, there's an inscribed boulder marking the spot where he preached Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. If you've ever seen Norman Rockwell's famous Christmas painting of the main street of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, less than a half a mile away on that same street is a large monument commemorating Jonathan Edwards' years of ministry in Stockbridge. And there's a sculpture of Jonathan Edwards on the side of the state capitol building in Hartford, Connecticut. Jonathan Edwards was made the president of Princeton in February of 1758. Soon after that, he received a smallpox vaccine, which gave him a fever. He died at 54 years of age on March 22nd, just a month after becoming president of Princeton. His last words were, "Trust in God, and you need not fear." Christian, a life fully devoted to Jesus will make an eternal impact. Stay the course.